My name's Ian Cook, Dr. Ian Cook. I'm a political scientist relying on climate scientists, which I did for my book, The Politics of the Final 100 Years of Humanity, 2030 to 2130. This is yet another of the videos that I've made to explain what's in that book. As I've said before, the book isn't sort of designed for a more general readership. It's more academic, sort of textbook type piece, and so I hope to try to explain these ideas into a couple of pieces I wrote for Medium, and also in the videos I'm making, of which this is one. Okay, so this is about my book, The Politics of the Final 100 Years of Humanity, 2030 to 2130. This is the 7th video. This is the 6th chapter of my book, which is about civil war and international conflict. I don't spend much time on civil war in this video because, for reasons I'll sort of express in the first one, but just quickly, civil war, it was more a concern for people interested in studying politics, because what is a war, how do wars happen, what are the causes of war? These are the sorts of things that political scientists are really interested in. And so, it was an opportunity for me to sort of get students and other people thinking about politics to think about war, civil war, and its relation to the environment or the climate. What I do in this video is focus very much on the second part, international conflict, because it's that I think is probably more immediately important and possibly interesting to the people watching these videos, and certainly it's going to have the sort of impact on everybody's lives. The civil war may not, because in many instances governments will just simply collapse. Groups may not have the resources to fight those civil wars, so we might see just more disintegration necessarily than warfare. But also, significant population pressures, significant regions will become unviable, unlivable, uninhabitable. People will start to want to move around. That's going to be causing conflicts. And also, as the climate changes, resources, particularly land that you can grow crops on, that changes the distribution of those resources, and conflicts are going to arise, in my view, as a function of that. So, most of this video is on international conflict. Before I get into it, though, I need to acknowledge that this land was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. So in this video, what I want to do is to basically talk about, first of all, resource conflict. And I've got sort of two elements of that. Water, it's an obvious resource. And the way water is distributed and water availability is going to become a source of tension, and so we're going to see water conflicts as one of the expressions of the politics of the final 100 years of humanity at an international level. The other thing we're going to see is what I call polar conflict. I don't know if the polar isn't a resource so much, but it is in the sense that the land, that if you look at maps of a 4-degree world, and that's what this is based on pretty much, is I've looked at this in the context of us hitting 4 degrees somewhere around 2080, 2090, and hopefully not going too much higher beyond that. But that's certainly something that, as the near worst case scenario that climate scientists are elaborating, appeared like to me. So water, polar conflicts. Now, the thing to note in here is that the Antarctic has very little land. So it's a completely different situation from the Arctic. And so most of this kind of polar conflict I want to talk about is about Arctic polar conflict, because there isn't going to be a lot of conflict around the Antarctic, because there's not going to be very much, or won't be that much to fight about, I don't think, unless, I guess, countries are trying to build islands in that area, but even then it's not clear as to how that will necessarily lead to conflict. So as I say, it's the Arctic that I'll focus on in the context of looking at conflict. And borders are going to be a central part of international conflict, and there'll be conflict at borders, or the use of borders to stop populations moving into territories is going to be an important part, as I see, of international politics, international conflict between 2030 and 2130. And to some extent, we're starting to see a little bit of that now in the climate change refugee idea, and that's one of the things I want to talk about. And part of what I want to do in that section is talk about mental borders, the way in which we're going to start to change our perceptions. This is part of that loss of humanity that I'm talking about in these videos, our ability to be humane and to care. And those borders are going to be powerful expressions of our refusal to care for at least some others. And that's sort of what I think is an important part of international politics. I have to say, as I do with all these videos, the views here and in my pieces on Medium, they're all my own. Okay, completely my responsibility. No one else ought to be held responsible for those. In many instances, or in some instances at least, it's not controversial views. So here we are, the politics of the final 100 years of humanity, international conflict. And this is the process of, in a sense, blocking the walls and policing and keeping refugees out, is an important part of. It says the movement, people are going to be pushed out of islands and drying lands, or burning lands, as I refer to it, sinking islands, burning lands is one of the titles or subtitles in my book. And this is going to cause people to want to find somewhere else to live and be looking for refuge. And that resistance to their seeking refuge, I think, is going to be an important part of the conflict associated with international conflicts. Let's start, though, with resource conflict. In the first instance, border. In the second, polar conflict. And then we look at border conflicts. Now, in order to sort of get my thinking right, I went to maps of a 4-degree world, 4-degree sea world. What that means is the world where average global surface temperatures have increased by 4 degrees Celsius. And so that's the story we're talking about here. That's the reality. So I found some maps, and it's them that I want to talk about while I'm sort of talking about the politics. This is a map that I'll focus on. And I've tried to track down the source. I've tried to get permission to use maps, and I was looking to get permission to use this map, and I just could not find the reason. It's said to have come out of the New Scientist, but I've looked through and I haven't been able to find that. The only thing that gives me at least a little bit of comfort is a map from Parag Khanna. Parag has given me permission to use this. Thank you, Parag. And that map bears some similarities to the 4-degree map, as I was talking about in the preceding video. So, I mean, you've seen both of these maps before, but unless you didn't watch that preceding video, in which case this is the first time you encountered it. Here's a map of a 4-degree world. There's that map, which seems to sort of be like the map I'm looking at. It doesn't matter. I mean, this is just an illustration. It's just a way of talking about what we're looking at in the context of international conflict. And the green parts are habitable, livable areas, and you can see partly I'm guessing it's a function of the lack of land in the Arctic that's led to these changing wind patterns, and so you can see green patches both in South America and in Australia. New Zealand is completely green, which is something that everybody should pay attention, particularly Australians, should pay attention to, but I'll get back to that one later. So this is the map I wanted to use, and this is, this map, and those green areas are important because, you can see, already you start to see some of the shape of the conflict we're talking about. You can see why I identified polar conflict. That's one of the ones that we need to focus on. Arctic polar conflict, I guess I should have said. Although there'll be a bit of, argy-bargy around, a bit of context around the Antarctic. There is some land, and there's certainly the temperatures there might be, more moderate, but with the wind patterns potentially producing sort of livable parts of Australia and New Zealand. I've already talked about Australia, so you've seen that in the context of national adjustment, but I want to come back to that because there's another way of looking at that map and Australia in that map that I want to use to talk about the shape of international conflict in 2030 to 2130. So let's start with resource conflict, in particular water conflict. Here's a piece, an edited work by Janine Salendi, Water and Sanitation Related Diseases in the Changing Environment. in particular, a piece by Barry Levy called Water and Armed Conflict. And what Levy says there is about 3/5 of water flowing in all rivers is shared by 2 or more countries, in 263 rivers basins in 145 countries. And basically this is just about the sort of the number of points, potential points of conflict. Now, water will dry up in a lot of those places and there won't be anything to fight about. But this is just an indication of that many countries, 3/5 of the water is shared by 2 or more countries. 2/5 of the world's populations live in these river basins. So it's a lot of people being affected by water and the changes around water. Circle of blue, produced a water conflict map, and the dark regions, as you can see, are the places where particularly vulnerable. And in 2016, they're saying, hey, these are the places to watch, and I'm assuming they're going to be places to watch as we go further. I'm particularly interested in the Indian region, and I want to just focus on that, just as an illustration of it. When countries share river systems, we'll get into these sorts of problems. So this is a Syrodarya river basin. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all countries sharing this resource. And you can see their sort of agricultural patches. And obviously it's, water sources are going to be crucial, and the upstream and downstream is going to be a powerful thing. But be careful. I mean, just because a country is downstream doesn't mean it's going to lose out necessarily. I mean, when you look at the Nile River system, for example, Egypt, which is in a sense on the end, is one of the most powerful countries, and it has real sway over what happens through the whole Nile River system. And so you can't just assume downstream, upstream, upstream have advantages over downstream. But clearly there's going to be conflict between upstream and downstream countries. And who's relying on that is going to be affected. To go from the Syria, these are all in that little patch for the Brahmaputra River system. Here we have China, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, all involved in this river system, all have had a stake in the water flowing through that system. Now, there are different rivers and there are different flows, so there'll be different effects that are going to occur. But these are all the countries drawn in to that conflict. And so this is a sort of, this is the problem, as it were. And here's the Indus River Basin. We have China, India, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, particularly Pakistan, China and India, very much at a place where we've got shared water, we've got real potential for conflict. As I said, this is the shape. The upstream water is going to be hard to get. It's not necessarily going to be less. It's going to fall less regularly. It might fall much heavier, and that's sort of what the researchers suggested. That there's not an argument to say there'll be no water. It rains in deserts. It's just the water leaches away, it evaporates quickly, and it's gone. And there's nothing to hold the water there. And when you dry areas out for long extended periods, they lose their structure, they lose their capacity to hold water. So the water just simply dissipates. And this is a profound consequence that we're going to have to address. That yes, there will be water, but it'll be really different in the way that it occurs. And that when countries share river systems, and this is the big one, right? China, Pakistan, India, nuclear weapons involved in this conflict, or potentially involved in this conflict. So when it comes to resource, there are various different ones. In the book I looked at fish and the way in which the changing temperatures are going to change migration patterns, and the people who rely on fish are going to be affected differently depending on which fish they rely on, where those fish are. So I looked at sort of fish, but here I just want to look at polar conflict as the other one under this. And as I say, polar conflict sort of includes a whole lot of different things. But okay, so North Pole. Why just start you off so you can see where it fits into that map, and you can see the dots. Now, some of them are resources, some of them are bases, but it's just a thinking. Right, here's exploitability of that area and the mentality. You can see that countries are thinking about this, and maps are being drawn up about this, and who owns what. And you can see Canada, the US, Russia, Norway, they're all positioned, Sweden, Greenland, all positioned around this. And, potential conflict seems to exist, and certainly exists in people's minds. Yet another representation is from yet another source, where once again trying to talk about the various different interests and what countries are doing. And when it comes up to what countries are doing, obviously the Americans are really interested in what the Russians are doing. I guess we're all interested in what the Russians are doing, but the Americans are particularly interested in what the Russians are doing, given their general interest in the Russians. And here, this is coming out of more conservative American think tanks. But as I say, this is just the thinking that I'm trying to illustrate. The thinking around the pole, around the Arctic, and the position. And we might as well finish with Dan Sullivan, representative of Hawaii, Russia's Arctic build-up. And then this is a map, a representation of the way in which the Russians are positioning themselves. Because if you saw that map, that's where the green is. So you can grow stuff there. People can live there relatively, much more easily than they can in the other part of the globe. Apart from bits in the south that I'll talk about later on. So when talking about poles, and you can see the thinking. This is a way people are already thinking about the politics. What I'm talking about is the politics of the final 100 years of humanity, 2030 to 2130. So the next one is borders. Now, physical borders obviously important, and physical borders are crucial part. It's the mental borders that for me are probably the more significant. Because that's part of this loss of humanity that I wanted to talk about, and the way in which hardening ourselves and refusing aid and refusing support is going to be an important part of the sort of mentalities and politics associated, in my view, anyway, with the final 100 years of humanity, 2030 to 2130. So borders is both sort of physical borders and, as I say, more interesting for me, the mental borders, the mental barriers, the ways in which people are going to come up with reasons, explanations, justifications, logics that support refusal, support putting on a border and saying, no, you're outside. So when it comes to borders, it's this stop, border control. That's the sort of, you can't come here. If you're looking at the stuff going on behind me, the caravans and the cars and the boats and the yachts, and so they're all being blocked at a certain point. They're hitting the border, and that's the sort of that's the idea that I'm trying to sort of get across in this one. So I get up with these, so refugee camps become the future, and the politics of the final 100 years of humanity is one in which refugee camps, as far as I can tell, are going to figure quite significantly as countries become unviable and their population shifts. So I just came up with some different photos of refugee camps to sort of illustrate the reality of the final 100 years of humanity. But it's the mental borders that I'm, as I say, particularly interested in. It's them that I want to sort of focus on in here. And it's refusing climate change refugees. That's an expression of it. And that's just a way of thinking about it. It's not the only way, but certainly the people seeking help, people being forced out of their sinking islands and burning lands, looking for help, hitting the walls, hitting the barriers, not being able to go further, being sent back or just being stopped. And I think it's just stopped. It's the key thing. So this refusing climate change refugees, I just want to look at that in terms of the sort of the protocols around refugees, because obviously climate change refugees are the first sorts of refugees we've encountered, and there's things about the way refugees are understood that's affecting the conversations. but I also want to follow that with looking at a court decision. It's a New Zealand court decision. It's just an illustration of sort of thinking that I want to talk about in terms of the creation of borders and the construction of borders. Anyway, we look at the Conventional Protocol relating to the status of refugees. It says a refugee is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country and unwilling to avail him or herself of the protection of that country. So that's the sort of general description of a refugee we get in the protocol. There's also the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that adds something to that and says everyone has a right to liberty and security of person, and every child shall have the right to such measures of protection as are required by her or his status as a minor on the part of her or his family, society, and the state. And this is important because this will come back in the court decision that I want to talk about in a minute. But these are the sort of, basically when you try to, when you seek to be designated a refugee, you've really got these conventions to work with. So that's how you make your claim, and that's how the refugees that we're looking at from Kiribati, in the case I want to talk about, Atiota, in a second. And this is, as I say, these principles will come back, and it's this, the blocking of it. They're not real refugees. They don't qualify. We've got these people called refugees. These people aren't refugees. Climate change, not refugees. There's no war. Okay, they're not real refugees because they're not being persecuted. They're not real refugees because they're migrants. And migrants are different from refugees. Migrants, people choose it. Refugees are seen as sort of forced. And so this sort of, as I say, these are these mental barriers. This is the dehumanising that I'm thinking of. It's going to occur as we just get hardened to the concerns, deaths of others outside our nation, and maybe perhaps ultimately inside to some extent. But it's this, as I say, the refugee stuff is on most interesting. So this is the Supreme Court of New Zealand. It's just simply an illustration. It's a decision that, I guess, brings together some of the thoughts and the ideas that I've been talking about here. And here we have Tetiota, Ioni Tetiota, and that case. And so the decision from the Court of Elias, William Youngblood, Arnold and Regan. And that was a joint decision, so one of the judges wrote that, and this is the judgment, or these are parts of the judgment. So, in relation to the Refugee Convention that we were talking about before, while Kiribati undoubtedly faces challenges, Mr. Teo does not, if returned, face serious harm, not a real refugee. Does not face serious harm. Okay. Kiribati's sinking. I have no idea. Not facing serious harm. It's not direct violent harm. It's not like war. It's not like those other sort of refugees. We get that. And there is no evidence the government of Kiribati is failing to take steps to protect its citizens from the effects of environmental degradation to the extent that it can. It's powerless. It doesn't have the resources to deal with this. It's not in a situation it can do anything. The idea that the Kiribati government could actually act, as an implicit acknowledgement, to the extent that it can't do anything. According to what we are seeing, New Zealand's going to be habitable in the post-4 degree world. Kiribati's going to be underwater. But that's not serious harm, and the fact that the government is powerless to do anything about it isn't a problem. So they don't get to be refugees because their powerless government might have power. I don't fully understand the logic here. Nor do we consider that the provisions of the ICCPR, the rights protection of the children and rights to life, liberty that I was talking about, nor do we consider that the provisions of the ICCPR relied on have any application of these facts. So there's the children involved, but the fact that their country sinking wasn't seen to be enough of a problem for those children that they should be let go to New Zealand to protect them from that threat. And so that case for me sort of also has the court's decision did not mean that environmental degradation resulting from climate change could never create a pathway into the Refugee Convention or protected person jurisdiction. And yet the whole logic of the arguments that I put in would seem to make that really difficult. So there's this sort of pretense, it seems to me. It might be time sometime I'm going to track. All you need to do is keep saying that for enough time and Kiribati will be underwater and the problem will be gone. So this sort of mealy mouth, sort of weak, we might care one day. I mean, this is part for me of the mental barriers. No, we'll just shut it down now and it stays shut down. Stay shut down. Doesn't open up again. Our decision in this case should not be taken as ruling out that possibility, the possibility of someone being accepted as a climate change refugee in an appropriate case. But what could be an appropriate case? There's nothing under that convention, there's nothing in international law that's directly and immediately able to be relied on by climate change refugees. And it's not them in isolation. This is the whole thinking that I'm talking about. It seems to me to be what we're looking for. And so when I look to Australia, just quickly, I don't want to spend much time, and I've just pulled out that bit of the map, and you can see these green parts. I mean, the first thing to note is the Australians out there. New Zealand, highly habitable. There was a time when New Zealand could have been part of the Australian Commonwealth. The Y turned up, I think, at the second convention. Don't quote me on that. But New Zealand's livable. When they were talking about us sort of forming a bubble in COVID with New Zealand, I thought that was a good idea because, basically, taking over New Zealand would be a really smart thing to do. This is from Paracana's unrecognisable. This densely populated island state has high-rise cities and intensive farms. This is about its livability. In another map, it talks about New Zealand, Tasmania, Western Antarctica, and Patagonia as being the only habitable parts. Okay, now I want to talk about those green. So particularly the one at the top, what we call the Northern Territory, at the top of Australia that you can see. Now, for those of you who may not be aware, directly above that is Indonesia. Highly populous country with no livable land. And north of them is China, huge population, no livable land in this 4-degree world. One possibility just occurred to me if I was thinking about this politically. I might think about what if we traded that part of Australia to the Chinese for their protection from the Indonesians. That if they could build borders and ensure that that we were protected, then we could offer that part to them. It's just a thought. I mean, this is the sort of politics, this is the thinking of the final 100 years of humanity, 2030 to 2130, that I'm just trying to illustrate in a book. I mean, it's not a truth, it's not necessarily going to happen, but it's just one way of thinking about it. And, taking on New Zealand, selling parts of Northern Territory to China, protection for Indonesia, there are possibilities. Just illustrating the politics of the final 100 years of humanity, 2030 to 2130, in particular civil wars and international conflicts. So that was me for today. In this video, I just want to talk about the resource conflicts, the water conflicts and the polar conflicts that are going to be part of the politics of the final 100 years of humanity, and also talk about the borders, particularly the mental borders, that are part of this sort of dehumanisation that's central to my idea of the final 100 years of humanity, 2030 to 2130. So that's me done. Thank you for watching. Please follow me on Medium and YouTube. Thanks.